Hello. Hello. Welcome to Critics Conversation. And tonight it will, in its entirety, deal with the master exhibition, Triage. Critical Conversations, it's organized by VISP. And when we organize art professionals or professionals in the art field on the west coast of Norway. And this Critics Conversations is sponsored by Art Council Norway, City of Bergen, the Faculty for Art, Music and Design, and Stiftelsen Fritt Ord. So I will just give the word to Rhea Dahl. She's the Managing Director of Young Artists Society.
Thank you. Yes, I am. Since the 1st of January, I stepped into the position as the director of UKS, the Young Artists Society in Oslo. But I presume that some of you might know me because actually I spent most of last year here. I was one of the conveners of the Bergen Assembly 2016, adjacent to a lot of other conveners. We were, I think, a total of 9 artistic directors. But I was one of the persistent ones who came back again and again. I think that's better. My microphone was making a noise. I came back again and again, working with 2 artists and my curatorial colleague, Christine Siegel. I worked with Linda Benglis and Marvin Gay-Chedwin for a full year. And many of you who took part, we actually had a great collaboration with the MA at KIP. I will be moderating tonight's critical conversation, and I'm very happy to be the moderator of that. I will do that with the perspective, two sort of important, I think, background tips on my moderating of this is that I actually myself curated an MA exhibition, the graduate show, last year at the Copenhagen Art Academy, dealing with 33 artists. And in 2013, I did a small MA show in Aarhus, Denmark, with only 5 artists. So that's a little bit of my background. Then I want to thank the 3 fabulous panelists next to me for coming and give you a short presentation and then say a little bit about what's going to happen. Well, so first, on the far left, you see Sabrina Tarasov. And she is an independent curator and writer, and she's actually Finnish, but now based in Los Angeles. From 2012 to 2016, she was the director of Shanene, which was an important non-for-profit exhibition space in Paris. And she's also a regular contributor to Moose, Freeze, Art Agenda, and Extra, Z Magazine, and Apartamento. And she's written for international galleries, artists, and institutions. And she currently runs an LA exhibition space and has actually been in the region for a while at this point because she came here for Be Open, then went to Oslo, and then came back. So it's great to have you here, Sabrina. Then we have next to Sabrina, Christopher Juel Larsen, that many of you probably know because he is a local and currently, while being a local, teaches literature at the Nord University in Bordeaux. And he actually puts together events for the Bergen Library and is Kunstkritik's art critic in Bergen and wrote about the show. So it's going to be great to hear you elaborate on the piece you wrote, the very nice piece you wrote. Beyond that, Christopher is a PhD student, and he's completing his thesis on the history of literary criticism in Norwegian radio, and he has taught courses in the genres and formats of art criticism and the NTNU. And then I should say that I have a personal relationship to Christopher. That's not erotic, but that actually Christopher also worked for the Bergen Assembly. So we know each other from that other endeavor last year. Then next to me sits Sigrun Åsebø. She's a PhD and associate professor at the Department of Linguistics, Literary and Aesthetic Studies at the University of Bergen, and she has written for Billedkunst, Bergens Tidende, and Kunstkritik, in addition to publishing numerous academic papers. And I know you a little bit from here as well, Sigrun, so yeah, great. With the three panelists, we're going to have a critical conversation around the exhibition. It's a degree show. It has 26 participating artists, and it's curated by Espen Johansen, who sits right here. Maybe you can raise your hand. Fantastic, well done. I'm not going to talk about every 26 of the artists, but I can say that it's framed by two artists who both work with present boats. The youngest being, and I should look this up proper so that I say it right, being Laurie Ballage, was born in 1994, and the oldest being Michelle M. Sparks, born in 1966, which maybe to some extent points to the variety and the multitude of positions that we're looking at here. And of course, having such a multitude of positions coming together is a kind of forced marriage also for the curator. There are loads of things you cannot do. You can't choose the artist. You probably also can't choose the artwork. But it kind of boils down to some very distinct features, I think, in curating, which is one that is about rhythm and pace, maybe architecture in the exhibition, and another, the discussions around the singular work that the curator has with the presenting artists. And to that note, I should say that triage has been made or in production over almost half a year. Since November last year, Espen has been working with the MA graduating artists, and conversation created what we see next door. And of course, that sort of points to the continuous conversation you would always have between the singular work and the sort of collective. But maybe also it is important to say that, at least to my experience, doing graduation shows is maybe one of the most gratifying things you can do as a curator, because there is no such time in an artistic practice that is that crisp and exciting and fun and wild and nervous as this particular moment. So it's really exciting to be with you today to talk about that. But the idea really is not to talk so much about the curatorial framework, which is a little bit why I did a bit of that right now. The idea is for us to try and dive into some of the strategies in the particular works or in more works clustering together in the forthcoming conversation. So what will happen now is that I'll ask each of the panelists, each of the critics, to talk a little bit about 2 or 3 strategies or artistic positions in the show that they wanted to pull forward. And then we're going to talk around that. When we've done that, we're going to open the floor for questions. I certainly have loads of them too. And then please participate. There's one thing I want to say. We sit here without that much pre-knowledge. And that's obviously often how audiences meet your work. So it's interesting to hear what the critics will say about your work without maybe knowing the factual trajectory. But there might be some good help and advice in some of the artists clarifying what this was actually about or telling a little bit of background. So if you feel we get stuck up here with a lot of mixed up and totally wrong information, please stop us. Please take part. And that obviously also goes for Espen. To come to the critics. I would like to pass on the word to you first, Sigrun. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. It's always difficult. I've reviewed quite a few of those exhibitions, and it's always difficult to somehow pick something from an exhibition like this, because sometimes you pick something based on the whole and because you need a theme. So I've decided I'm not picked according to who I think is going to make it in the art world. I've approached the exhibition now so that we're going to talk about different topics, and I thought I'd do the things that I find resonating with things that I work on, which is a lot related to identity, sexuality, the body, and those kinds of questions. So this is the sort of politics part of it, and then someone else can talk about the material part, and then the other things. So as I was going through it, I was thinking about one of the things that we always pin to, or seem to pin a lot of things to this day, is materiality. And I was thinking about the politics of somehow materiality, and there were a few works that sort of stood out that are working with identity in a poetic way, in a way, a sense of relating to the world. So the first thing that I wanted to pick was, I think there are a lot of interesting pieces, but I kind of like pieces that stage themselves well. And I think number 5 was a well-staged room with a lot of nice works. And I think the work by Yan Yi Kao, which I cannot pronounce, Chinese, there was a nice little poetic piece on the way of trying to relate to the world through language, through engaging with the visual world and the material world. And it's a sequence of photos that almost forms a film, but a sequence of photos that starts, as far as I can see, in the private space with what I assume to be the artist herself. And there's a voiceover talking in, as far as I could understand, Norwegian most of the time. But it has the accent of trying to learn language, and you can see somehow aspects of the town of Bergen, her going through it, writing in signs in the parking lots, on the pavements, the feet of people walking by, and it's in black and white, so it has this kind of aura of art photography, perhaps, what you would, that distance that it isn't in color. And I thought that it presented very well some kind of how do you call it? Way of relating to the world through the body, and trying to embody language and inhabit the space where you are. And I thought that had a nice, interesting cultural questioning to it that also resonated with other works in the exhibition, for example, which is much more explicitly related to identity, Michelle Sparks' boat that you were talking about, which was one of the pieces that obviously easily talks to you when you enter the exhibition, because it's the one that talks to you, one of the few that talks to you in this exhibition. There used to be a lot more video a few years ago, but now there's not so much talk, it's very silent. But that one talks to you, and it's the Oselva boat, local boat, old boat, and of course it talks to me because I recognize the smell from my childhood, the smell of the sea and the smell of the old boat when you're inside of it. And then it's the poem of Terje Vigen that you probably know. I don't know whose piece it is. And as far as I could understand, it's read by children at Slettebakken skole, which is a very international school. So you can both see the names of the people, I assume the names of the children reading it are international names, and you can also sometimes hear the accents. And the reading of Terje Vigen is, well, the poem is Ibsen, so it's obviously related to Norwegian cultural heritage, but it's also a poem about the famine of Norwegian people during the Napoleonic Wars, as far as I can remember, where he's rowing to Denmark to get food for his family, and then he's shot almost before approaching the land. And in that sense, it's both poetic, related to Norwegian identity in a very edible way. It feels very good. But if you read it in a political context, it's obviously also relating to the refugee crisis, etc. So it's, somehow history repeating itself, both in a good and in a bad way, and how you relate to your country, and is this so distant at all? So it had a sort of personal resonance, and as well as a political and historical thing. And there are also other works that work on history, which I think is on cultural history, which I think is kind of interesting. But the other thing I was thinking about was there also seems to be some of the works working on reworking the industrial society in a sense, and also reworking a kind of masculinity in this context. So the ones that are explicitly, as far as I could see, referring to renegotiating masculinity as, of course, the performance in the Inner Room by Elias Bjørn. Yeah, which unfortunately I haven't seen, except for the photographs on the wall. But there are also the works of Arild Våge Berge, I think, which is also relating both to nature. What's it called again? It has a very nice title.
The gravity of the lake.
Yeah, the gravity of the lake. When you have the small sort of constructive pieces of concrete scattered around the exhibition, that seems to relate to engineering and the Norwegian way of exploiting, or not exploiting, but using the natural resources for waterworks, etc., so renewable energy and all of that kind of thing. But then in the Inner Room, there's a small story which I read as the story of him, the artist, visiting his grandfather, as far as I can understand, who was working on this waterworks in the western part of Norway, and how he's relating in the generational thing, the passing on of meeting the sort of an old type of masculinity that he is relating to in family, but there's still something distant, and they are somehow connecting and cross generations in this piece that is very material and concrete, relating to the world. And then that's also, of course, I was thinking about the same way of relating to sort of industry and engineering, and as a way of approaching the world, is Henning Klungtvedt, who shows a sort of concrete divider as related to work with a fence on it. That's what you see through here. And when I read the text, there's reference to Russian constructivism and industrial society, and that makes me think about how this modern industrialism was a specifically is a lost thing now. The masculinity of the rational human being of Russian constructivism is a lost thing that you're trying to relate to, and now it's classed very much more than before, and it's both very present but still lost and as a modern idea. So I think those works are interesting in that sense. And then there's a different kind of materiality that we could talk about later, which is the more bodily thing. But I'm going to, finish there.
Yeah. Do you want to comment on Sigrun's little rant?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that there's a direct segue in terms of what you're talking about of this bodily affect and about relating to different types of masculinity. And what I kind of wanted to talk about was the maybe inversion of that, of how we come to things, and do we come to things through history, or do we come to things through an intellectual ordering, or does it come from that place of the body, or does it come from a place of affect? And I think one of the things when we were walking through the space is we ended up having a lot of conversations amongst ourselves about pieces that were like Ingrid Bjørnseth's Do Walls Blush piece, which is a painted wall in 3 different colors, which happens on regular intervals, or the candy pieces by Vilde Lørenberg Blom, or this kind of soft apocalyptic tent by let's see now, Murray Nordahl. No, sorry, Aaron Sexton.
Exactly.
Exactly. And what I serendipitously, while we were taking notes and talking about this afterwards, came across a book on Richard Tuttle, which the Kunsthallbergen had produced a few years back. And in this, one of the texts, the curator's talking about how Tuttle's practice defies art historical categories, which are stylistic or conceptual or otherwise, and kind of negates these impositions from the outside, or negates the impetus that we would have to be under the gaze of theory in some sense. And so instead they propose that his practice is this kind of archetypal aesthetic response to that happens prior to the absorption of that kind of knowledge, or that aids the absorption or understanding of a framework that may lie beneath. And so he talks, I think the one key phrase that kind of set me into this was that the curator calls Richard Tuttle's practice a productive distraction. And this really somehow, walking out with the thoughts of Ingrid's wall painting, stuck with me in the sense of having a history implied in something, and something that creates a distraction to the space in the sense that it's a color that changes. It's a very subtle gesture. We could relate it back to institutional critique. We could relate it back to a history of minimalism or a conceptual gesture, or wherever we want to. But primarily, these different colors will be an effective point of contact, which goes across history and goes across specific categories of art. And so I guess this started to just make me think about how we can address, for example, the bodily experience as something that is maybe political, or that of affect as something political, because we have a contact that we can tease meaning out of. And we have something at surface that caches within it what might not be obvious, but can still be a subject. And it's hard, again, like you were saying in the beginning, Rhea, that as critics and as observers, we're coming into a space and not getting a lot of knowledge about what these things are, but the small snippets of information, such as, and please somebody step up if I'm wrong, but Ingrid's wall piece being painted colors that come from other institutions, the walls or the outside facades, the colors of these. It's, from what I remember, it's one of them is unpainted yellow, one is hospital green, and the other is night sky blue, which also constitute the titles of these pieces. And these become, I mean, rather than thinking about this as an institutional critique or some sort of an absorption, it becomes a guest framework, or a framework where you can host other maybe institutional ideas or different affects and see or test those points of contact to the other artists in the space. And so I guess referring back to what you're talking about, the bodily, it becomes this thing of what kind of relations we form, or what is that space of relationality in terms of having maybe forming associations between 26 perhaps unrelated artists in any other way except that they went to the same school and they share a classroom ethic, a daily practice, a studio space maybe. And how do those very aesthetic surface things start to bounce ideas around one another? The other thing, maybe more directly related to the body, that I was thinking about in similar notion was these candy pieces by Vilde Lowenberg Bloom, which is called When Drops of Syrup Form Hard Brittle Threads in Cold Water. And I mean, I suppose most people have seen it, but they're the hooks, the kind of BDSM-esque meat hooks with candy dripping down in bright colors.
Right when you enter the exhibition.
Right when you enter the exhibition, right. And it's like pulled taffy, and it smells really saccharine, and the colors are bright, and you think about things like Tivoli, and like I was saying to these guys, you have kind of an instinct to taste it, or lick it, or touch it, or do other non-acceptable things in the gallery space with it. But again, this is really direct, like the contact you have and the affect and the kind of, not to get into the phenomenology of objects really, but the history of associations that you might dig out of that, or the meaning that you can tease out of that, starts first and foremost by a bodily impulse to interact with the piece, which is, which kind of pertains to this defiance of categorization and the different types of access routes, which may in some cases be, and not to make a value judgment between artists in this show necessarily, but can be a more powerful gesture politically or socially or effectively than giving something out straightforwardly and representationally. And I think there's been a lot of discussion during my time in Norway about why there's been a recourse to craft materials, or why there's a recourse to making things with your hands, or relating to things. And you can see this at the Biennial, and you can see this at when you visit MFA studios, not only here, I think, but in Los Angeles, certainly in Paris. Which then, to kind of tie this together, to give it over to Christopher, to me speaks to this triage theme in a way where the question of the show ultimately becomes, in a world full of curatorial decisions, artistic decisions, institutional decisions, how do you start to prioritize and order all of those forms of complexity? But firstly, how do you start to order, prioritize, like, theories or the critics, or the criticality or theory or history over materiality? And can that be inverted to have a more effective politic to art?
So I'll be the mediocre man on this panel. I wrote a review of the show published on kunstkritikk.no, which I hope some of you have had the chance to read. And my take on the show is very much along the lines that have already been discussed. I mean, the materiality is the concept that loans itself most easily for talking about the show as one, and that's it. You have to have some sort of hook to hang it on if you're going to make some sort of coherent statement about it. And I thought I'd continue on that line. What I'm writing in that review is really just a collection of examples of different ways of dealing with the question of materiality, and dealing with, well, the many different issues that materiality can be connected to, like the question of masculinity that has been discussed, and the question of the institution that we just talked about or heard about. And rather than talk more about the stuff I'm writing about there, I thought I'd bring up two other pieces that I didn't have space for in the review. The first being Tova Fransson's untitled 10-meter forest in the end of the room over here. The long printed piece of paper with steel held up by steel rods. And it's a piece that deals with seriality. It has ink prints of what I gather is an item used in the printing process for keeping distance. And this very monochrome print is repeated over the whole piece of paper. And this piece deals with the materiality of media, of course. It's about, very obviously, about print culture, and which we all assume is coming to an end, but it isn't really happening at the same time. Or print culture is, in any case, taking on a different shape or form than it had, and a different role. But so print culture, in that sense, is ending, and I assume that the work is dealing with those issues. But it also deals very much with the material and aesthetic side of print culture, and what what was made to create a very a similar expression repeated seriality. It's never really that repetition is never really successful in this piece. No print is similar to the other. They're all unique, and it's a lovely piece, and it's quite poetic, and it has both a sort of nostalgic tinge to it, as it deals with this disappearing culture, and also that sort of comes through the aestheticization of an industrial or an industry that we're not. That of course it's very it's been commonplace to aestheticize now, but it does it in a very nice way. So that was the one piece I like to just start by casting light on, and the other is a piece that deals also with the materiality of the media, but in a very different way. Malin Overholt's Tracing the Discarded Line, the discarded in lines and layers, a frottage print, or frottage prints. I think there are 3 prints that are put on top of each other. And what she's done is she's made frottage prints of a plastic, these thin plastic folios. And frottage prints is a technique used mainly for recreating like old and brittle pieces of art and architecture and archaeology. And so this is sort of tongue-in-cheek gesture to how what is considered to be worthy of preservation, of course. That may not be very original, but it still has a very aesthetic quality to it. And of course, that she uses plastic as her as the medium that she reproduces through the frottage print, makes it political in a sense, in that the question of plastic and how we discard plastic is a political question today. And she raises that issue in her work. And frottage prints is often used on stone, and we are now entering a time, many of you know, that we have now discovered stone that is completely made out of discarded plastics. So it becomes a direct comment on this Anthropocene that has been talked about so much. I think that materiality becomes so important for this show is of course not an accident. It's time. It's dealing with questions that are pressing to everyone. And I think maybe one of the things that pushes materiality to the fore is that we're having problems with finding a theoretical framework that lets us deal with many of the pressing issues that we want to deal with, and that taking a more direct approach through the material qualities of our surroundings and our world lends itself more easily for a productive result. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Thank you, all three of you. So I have a few questions coming back to some of the things you've said, but obviously you're all invited to comment. I guess since it's a critics conversation, you can also be the critics or critical towards the critics. So please do that. But maybe one place I thought we could continue from here, or that sort of threads in with some of the things each of you have sort of touched upon, but maybe haven't been spoken about so explicitly, is the idea of, say, you could call it performativity or time in the show, that obviously relates to the work you were talking about, Sabrina, by, and I should say it proper, Ingrid Bjørnseth, the painting of the wall that changes over the course of the exhibition. But another piece that does relate to that kind of performativity and change of the object over the course of the time of the exhibition, and in a way, in that sense, sort of threads back to the idea of the conservation and maybe even sort of the impossibility of conservation, could be the piece by Icaro Sorbar in number 5, where you can basically listen to these poetic tapes, and there is a piece of music being played back constantly on an LP. And what actually does happen is that over the course of the exhibition, the same piece of music or the same round is played back so many times that by the end of the exhibition, there will be no more sound. Well, or at least it will be silenced slowly. So maybe, since that has been something you haven't talked so much about, maybe you can, or could you each say a little bit about sort of how you see, how you see different works that operates and works with time in the exhibition, how you see them function, or do you see that as a strategy, or do you actually think it's something that is sort of highly bypassed?
Me?
Yeah, maybe you start, Sabrina.
Sure. Well, if we're going to Ingrid's piece and talking about the performativity, if you want to call it that, which actually I kind of maybe disagree with. Time factors in, but I'm not sure that I would at least like to see the painting of the space as a performance, only because there, if it's a performance, it's a really hidden one, and it doesn't happen in the space, and somehow it would take some of that silence off the piece, or some of that objecthood, or whatever you want to call it, out of the piece, to say that it's about the person painting it then, or that this person comes in and it's like an event, even though it does happen on weekly events. However, the time is maybe interesting for it. It's also maybe pragmatic in the sense that if you want to paint 3 different colors of institutions, then you need some time. You need staff, or you need whatever. You need people to be able to see it as well. But I think maybe more interestingly, the candy pieces probably have more of like a relationship to both performativity and time, and this may just again have to do with my wild impulses to lick the pieces, but there's something about this gesture of like slinging sugar, and like we were talking about, the process of making taffy has to do with mixing up molecules within the sugar and water compounds, so that after a while the taffy stays soft because the molecules can't find each other anymore. They can't bind. So instead of crystallizing or hardening like in hard candy at a certain temperature, they just kind of float freely around. So without going into a conversation about like the contingency of materials, or about this like kind of speculative proposal that might be, more simply that bodily interaction again with this kind of malleable, voluble substance is an act in itself. And maybe again, this is like, if it's performance, then it's one that's not meant to be seen by an audience, or not maybe meant to be considered under some sort of an auspice of performance or under a categorization, but rather as a means to making, like baking might be, or as a chemical process. But that being said, that question of conservation is really interesting, because we were talking about it of if it's maybe there's something else in this, but if it's a organic substance, then how do you preserve it? And I don't know, is there an intent for a collector buys it into their house, and does it start to, I mean, I guess you can keep taffy for a long time, no? And like, or candy in your cupboard. But anyway, there comes a point where, does this go bad? How do you preserve it? Is it meant to be preserved? Does it have a life? Does it change form over time? And maybe those things are all more relevant to think about. But I have no answer as to what the relationship would be.
But it's actually interesting that in the exact same space, we have the painting in the ceiling by, I'm just going to say that proper, Miss Solberg, Aurora Solberg. And that obviously is also a piece that questions the whole idea of preservation, because I would presume that that piece is and has to be destroyed, that is, washed off the moment the exhibition ends.
But don't you think there are sort of different kinds of performativity in those works, and that the painting of the wall she's somehow performing different kinds of institutions and how they interact with another in this space during the course of time of this exhibition. And the painting up on the ceiling is also, it will be present during the exhibition, so it's somehow performing or staging itself during this master exhibition. And then, of course, any work is doing that during any exhibition.
Yes.
But I think the materiality and the performativity of the candy piece, which I think is, perhaps I might be wrong, but perhaps it's the only piece that is somehow specifically related to the neo-materialism's theory of the performative material, which is the molecules they are performing in themselves is autogenerative in a way, and it's the artist who engages with the material, but this still has a certain own kind of materiality and performativity that it preserves within itself as an object and as materiality. So it's somehow different, and I think that's you can talk about materiality, but I'm not sure that there are so many other objects that are going into exactly that kind of new materialism, except for this candy piece.
I would have to agree, and I think something that I was noting down and thinking about was how a specific type of art world figure, specifically critics and institutional writers or people who are writing in a certain type of language, tend to use words relatively freely, and for us, without faltering into those traps, it might be materiality, which I find is really hard to justify, because everything has a materiality and everything is matter and everything is a part of a medium, you know? So us saying that the show is about materiality becomes kind of a moot point, because I mean, you could say that, or you could justify each piece through the material it's created in. However, if the conversation is going to be specified a little bit, then maybe that is also maybe that's somehow a central agent then of like talking about new materialism. Although, like, coming from my affective point of view, I'm reluctant to, because that's drawing it deeper into theory again and dredging it, you know. But it's true, and I think this could be seen in Aaron Sexton's work, and maybe that's an interesting one to discuss as like an intersection between, you know, performativity and like the staging and theatricality and certain types of materialisms, like, let's say, just to brief, Aaron Sexton's piece, which is not on the screen, but anyway, is basically different types of materials, like polyester fabric, there's polystyrene, there's wood, there's a tarp, like a blue camping tarp, and all of these things are installed in a way that mimic kind of provisional topographies or different types of radio transmitters or knots that become provisional gestures referring to mathematical models, but in very beautiful aesthetic ropes and in kind of like playful forms where you have to really maybe imagine the more mathematical or scientific reality of these things. It's funny. It's funny. It pertains to a certain type of staging as well, of a series of objects becoming a scene, maybe, or a staging of a scenario, which may pertain to a conspiracy theorist out in the woods listening to like sci-fi emissions, hoping to find extraterrestrial life, or whatever fantasy you want to imbue into this. But it brings into the question of how can we figure a certain type of materialism that isn't available to us, if that makes sense. Such as like space, or such as like a cosmic timescale, or such as these radio emissions, or trying to hit frequencies, or trying to imagine a topography. And maybe sometimes the most efficient way to do that is to throw a tarp in the air and suspend it and say Earth.
But there, there is also a question there of, I mean, the tarp, it's shelter, so it's trying to, and shelter is trying to defend oneself from like the forces of nature and the force of what actually is time moving, because it's not actually quite true that there aren't any other pieces that changes through the exhibition here. Aurora's other paintings, the paintings that are on the wall, have also changed quite dramatically since they were first exhibited, as far as I can tell. The nature of the paper and the topographies that have been created in there, and also I know there's been some nervousness about the terracotta boat upstairs, whether it would last through the exhibition itself. Will it? Because it's such a brittle construction. So I think, and there are some there's a good reason to bring in time as a concept to discuss some of the works here. Maybe not that many, but it's for many. I think it becomes interesting. Also because so many of like the piece on the gravity of a lake focused into one point, which has these stones and stone formations. Of course, time doesn't factor in to the exhibition itself, but beforehand, these stone formations and how they look, it's a direct inscription of time. The dripstone.
They do have this. There is this chalk drawing that we actually.
Oh
see
yeah,
right
actually,
now
which
on the
has
floor
been.
That I guess will potentially vanish when.
Yeah, it was. I think it
walk over it.
was damaged on the first
Maybe
first
just damaged.
day.
Shouldn't walk over.
Actually.
But it was not. It was. Yeah. It wasn't to say that. It was in a way to reflect a little bit also on like a perspective of, say, the Malin Overholt frottage pieces that you were talking about them as in sort of a museology context, as kind of trying to preserve the normally unpreserved, and which sort of led on to the question of I think a kind of timeliness of the exhibition, ideas of conservation, and maybe also performativity. And but of course, and maybe it's just important to say here that there's of course the performance we haven't seen, and that we're thus not gonna talk, I guess, so much about, by Diva Helmi, which happened on the opening, and I think on the 23rd of April, which was played in the very front room, right where you enter, where basically a cellist would play together with, while a modern dancer would dance, and this in the choreography there would be a kind of feedback loop, so that when the dancer would do particular gestures, there would be a censoring system sending back little ignitions to the musician, so that he or she would get, he, I guess, would get a little sort of a little shock, a little electric shock, thank you, and thus changed the music. And I guess that is the one sort of very deliberate performance piece next to the piece, the pieces that you were referring to, Sigrun, that has happened in public space. Are there any questions or comments from you? Then I actually had a different question, and that maybe sort of goes in a slightly different direction. We were talking about whether we should or not in the in this conversation also talk about, does this exhibition register? Does it have, does it show a kind of particular direction of the Bergen Art Academy? Does it show a tendency in a generation? And without maybe asking that question like spot on, one thing that did spring to my eyes when seeing the show was this, the absence of what you could phrase as post-internet works, or which would be a kind of sort of pop cultural-led, sort of surface-oriented, often screen-oriented aesthetics that has been around, and that I have seen personally in many a degree show. And actually, it was interesting to me to see that there was less of that, and maybe also less of, say, pop strategies in general. That, yeah. And I wondered if that was anything you reflected on.
Somebody told me while I was in Bergen the first time that new romantic painting is the new post-internet. So maybe that's it. Maybe that's it.
So that would be the, and I guess with.
But it's quite on the face of it at least a quite serious show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The moment you walk in on the surface, it's there are no very apparent jokes, maybe apart from the candy and the umbrellas, of course. But that's maybe more of a local joke.
That being said, the post-internet question isn't really about things being funny or not, because I mean, the joke was on them, to be fair, in post-internet. But I think it's more a question of maybe the conversation we were having around this show had less to do with a specific style that was being promoted within the group, or a cohesion, or trying to trend spot something, but as to, again, just relating this back to the triage theme, of different models of decision making and how those were negotiated within the space. So I guess just to maybe map some of these is that on top you have an institutional decision-making process, and there's decisions made, for example, in where it's being exhibited, or there's political decisions being made, and there's a political premise for various models of interaction, which might be the big picture. Do we go and, like I was saying, stage a biennial in Athens, but the decision there is that we won't have any artwork. It's just going to be theorists, and these theorists are going to sit in a room and talk about how to save the art world. On another level, you have curatorial decision-making, where the curator of the show, for example, comes in and sees all these practices and starts to make informed spatial discussions based on, or decisions based on discussions he's having with the artists. And then at the very bottom, you have artistic decision-making. Now, all of these different types of decisions and all of the priorities that each person individually or each organization is modeling form a whole lot of complexity. And there's a lot of difficulty involved in and I think anybody who works in an institution or anybody who's worked with as an artist with somebody else knows this, that reconciling all of those things can be extremely hard. And so what we were noting about this show is that there seemed to be a sort of an attempt towards democracy within those things, and maybe that's what the cleanliness and that's what the seriousness or that feeling of austerity is a little bit, that it's a very, there's a leveling, and I think that to play devil's advocate, there's a question of whether or not this is entirely a good thing or a bad thing, in terms of seeing perhaps on one hand the institution as a process of distillation, or like one would see contemporary art daily as a process of whitewashing through creating ideal or ideological spaces through Photoshop. On the other hand, you can see this as a negotiation of space and a reconciliation, or negotiation or an intrinsic negotiation of different types of practices. Discuss.
No, but I make the point in my review also about the exhibition catalog and how that's put together. And if you want to read it, you have to open it, and thus sort of you inherently destroy the order that everything is presented in. So you have to, it is an attempt to create a sort of democratic book,
right,
where the reader is given the power to order the different artists themselves. At least that's one solution to that problem. And I think that will always be in any way you approach that problem. It will always be an ideal solution, never a real one. But it's I agree that it's an ideal in this exhibition, and I think it's sympathetic.
In what way?
Well, I think it's sympathetic in the way that the group presents itself as a group and tries to be a group, and that's also a reflection on what the educational experience is in some way.
Okay, but at the same time, you have a space which is designated, and there's an MFA, for an exhibition, there's a structure. So you're graduating from school, you don't have a lot of choice except to be a group and to show in a group, unless you're like,
sure,
the black sheep who departs from the group, throws a tantrum, does the punk thing. But at the same time, there was this big case last year, maybe, at USC, which is one of the universities in Los Angeles. And there was a group of artists who realized that within their MFA program, all of the kind of financial promises or the financial structures that had been assigned to them or allocated disappeared under a certain type of leadership. And so all of these students, 10 of them or whatever, decided to drop out. And so through this gesture of dropping out from the institution, they formed a sense of community because of this, of solidarity, which I think came up as a sort of catchphrase in some of the discussions today. But that gesture only lasted for a while. And, if they're watching this, I'm sorry if I'm wrong and putting words into everybody's mouth. But after a while, I feel like that togetherness that they held onto because of this one act really splintered, because they did an exhibition, like they did an exhibition with us at Shenene, and they wanted to keep that kind of MFA moment going. But at the same time, at one point, you're all individuals, and your practices, in fact, are totally different, or they're totally independent, and you're joined by a proximity, which isn't to like negate companionship, and it is sympathetic. It's a sympathetic togetherness, but it's not necessarily an aesthetic one. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the cohesion of the show doesn't necessarily mean a cohesion of the group, and it can be down to clever curatorial gestures. It can be down to clever placement. You can probably make a whole lot of different solutions look good within a space, but then I guess what are you sacrificing, or what are you, or are people making huge compromises? You said there were no arguments though, which is cool.
I mean, I think always these kinds of exhibitions, there is always, unfortunately, somebody who doesn't get exactly the spot that you might have needed to do justice to the work.
Right.
It's inevitable.
Well, which
I
is the
think.
case in
Yeah.
in your professional life as well.
Yeah. So and I think those shows are always different, and sometimes you can see that there hasn't been enough space, so somebody's hidden in a corner and they shouldn't been hidden in a corner, and there's a huge piece that isn't really very good and it's in the middle because it was so huge that it had to have a lot of space, and those kinds of things. There's not very much you can do about that, and I don't think this exhibition is. I think it's the good thing about it. There's probably somebody who isn't happy about their placement, but I think there isn't anyone who obviously has a terrible spot.
No,
here.
but I don't think it's about placement.
And I think, and I don't necessarily think that it has. It seems like it has some kind of inner logic, but I'm not sure that it has. Like you
I don't
say,
think so.
it's.
I don't think so either. Well, I mean, I think there is because there's still a title and there's still something that's been discussed.
Yeah, well, but that's
whether,
just you have to
know,
frame it in some way.
Kind of, but I guess what I'm getting at is not placement, and it's not about the exhibition necessarily, or how the artworks form relationships between themselves, but there's also other models for MFA shows, for example. So there's models where you do 3 people do this week, 3 people do the next week, and you have your own assigned space, and then your show has its own title, for example, and you gain a sense of autonomy, or you have more space to yourself instead of rendering it a curatorial proposal. And so I guess if there's a discussion to be had in terms of what this model is doing, it's that does it benefit people to be put into a proximity where it looks like a curatorial gesture? Or is there another solution that one can discuss? Or what does that structure entail?
There is obviously other solutions that could be discussed, but to the point you raised earlier about what is the how is this how is the politics of this show articulated? I think emphasizing the school as a potentially democratic institution is also an ideal, of course, but also a powerful political statement. And I think maybe it's sort of a post-theoretical statement, because it goes counter to many of the notions that have been important to sort of, in all our discussions about power for, like since Foucault died. Which I think maybe is I think that democratic impetus is that there's a point there that they're trying to make, or maybe not trying to make, but it makes it.
So what kind of power then, how do we negotiate the power of the educational institution, which is inevitably linked to, let's say, the ministry, and especially in, Norway linked to, I'm sure, funding structures in the future and a certain type of revenue that comes in later as an artist. And this idea of, and I don't necessarily know if I believe this, but just to act as a jeune provocateur, the democracy that it promises rather than the democracy that it is. Because, I mean, here it's not a question of paying for school, but elsewhere it is. And so what the question of, like, why do you do an MFA is kind of a big one in a lot of countries.
Well, I think that bringing the, I think it's important to read it in a Norwegian context.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not a solution that would necessarily lend itself to like be put in any other place, but in a social democracy that is always under pressure, and I think it's quite a grand political statement in that sense.
That
The underlining of the democratic ideal of the school institution.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
Coming to like taking this back to this idea of maybe not post-internet, but maybe pop, maybe humor. I think there is a series of works that we haven't talked about at all that's in the exhibition that kind of deals with kind of humorous take on everyday life and even everyday life in Bergen, which would be Tia Kasper's piece with the umbrellas that are sort of placed in a pile and sort of, yeah, kind of, I know Bergen weather, but commenting on the being in this city, there is Sjur Aida Ås piece, which is the little sink and a, well, maybe not that like everyday item, but a ladder hung high, so it makes you feel like if that would be a ladder out of a swimming pool, then you would have drowned a long time ago in the exhibition space. And then, of course, the Louise Butler's this nice little red bench that's walking around in the exhibition that I think was forgotten when we talked about the sort of very deliberately, almost tongue-in-cheek kind of humorous pieces. Because that piece, I don't know if you know, but that piece is basically carried on the back of one of the gallery assistants or gallery surveillance personnel and relocated in the space every day so that you can basically go and sit down and you have the focus on a new piece. Yeah, there's a funny little link here, which is the other piece that she's done is actually a kind of abstract painting that maybe is a little bit romantic. So if the post-internet is the romantic painting, then maybe there's a link back to the humor. That was far-fetched, admittedly. But maybe just but to stay with this line of work that we haven't talked so much about, and maybe also including Marie Nordahl's piece, which is this piece that is sort of 3 chunks of stuffed pink fabric in different qualities that bump into each other in front of a mirror again and again all the time. Yeah, it would just now that we haven't talked so much about any of these strategies, and they are obviously very, very different from like super tongue-in-cheek to, you could say, maybe somehow sort of feminist-led disco dancing to sort of mirror stage Freudian ideas. But could you maybe say a little bit about some of these and how you relate it to that in the show? Because it's been kind of excluded from the conversation thus far.
I really like those things. I like the pink things. That was the one thing that I didn't talk about. I talked about the serious ones and industry and everything, and then the materiality and the sensuality of those pink blobs dancing in front of the mirror, which I really, really like. And you said that she had done performances with those kinds of costumes. Is that true? Or because that made me think about, I can remember an old piece by Louise Bourgeois when she was walking in the streets in a latex covered suit. There's sort of a lot of blobs all over it, just walking solemnly down the street in that kind of outfit. And the humor of doing that and the abjection of somebody in that kind of bodily shape. So it reminds me of those kinds of old feminist 70s working with the abject body. And also the humorous things of Sarah Lucas, obviously, and all that kind of textile art. And there's very little sort of craft in this exhibition, except that kind of textile. And the casting of Sofia Magdalena Eliasson, which is right next to it, the plaster thing, also has that kind of everyday materiality to it. There's some kind of textile or a different kind of materiality from concrete and all of that kind of industrial material. So I think the humor of that, the dancing, bodily incomplete pink things that are somehow representing, I don't know, tutu skirt or something in front of the mirror. And it was today it was placed with a bench right in front of it. So I somehow, when I came in, assumed that the bench was part of the whole thing, which made it somehow. Why is this red bench seating you in front of this? That would include you in the mirror. Very, you're always included in the mirror when you're standing there, but in a very different way. So I think the humor of those two things together, where you become both a spectator looking at yourself and a sort of an object amongst those pink objects dancing in there, and also the bench that makes you understand, both in that spot and other places, that you're always placed in front of a view, in a sense, and that as you're moving around, you're carrying some kind of cultural bench, perhaps, or some kind of baggage, where you place yourself and view the world from different kinds of bodily spots, or by way of viewing, that kind of underlines, and when it moves around, it underlines how the whole thing is a question of viewing and experiencing by sight and body. So I find that very interesting, and I was, and also the candy that somehow relates, and the pinkness relates to the sassiness of those kind of dancing soft objects. But I was also thinking of the plaster of Sofia Magdalena Eliassen. I don't know if she's here. I read the statement, and it had some kind of casting sort of things that were lost, looked like there were letters, looked like there was cloth, looked like there was kind of different kinds of materials that you would try to sort of hold on to by making them concrete, but they are still sort of washed away. And I think the kind of materialization of that, the incompleteness, it's like the tactile and sort of very institutional thing of making the frottage. It's a very different way of sort of preserving. It's a very scientific way of preserving something that is lost. And then you have this plaster casting that's a very more concrete, in a sense, that you would destroy the thing that you're actually trying to preserve, etc. So I think that's very interesting, and the humor that's in it, and the way that it's much more related to sort of bodily experience and affect. So I think those pieces were very, very interesting in that sense. And the umbrellas, of course, are a very obvious, humorous way of reflecting upon waste, which is the most, where you have a lot of waste, lost umbrellas, and somehow you're preserving them in this ethnographic Foucauldian cupboard where they are sort of labeled on the jars, and everything sort of plays on the whole Foucauldian thing, categorization of the world, which is, of course, very humorous. And it's one of the only pieces, I think, that works in that kind of tradition, mimicking the science in that distance way. So so I thought those were very interesting in this contest, coming from a different place.
I think that there are very many of the pieces, and also the pieces that we have already talked about, that are very funny. Ikara Sorbar's installation in number 5 with the cassettes, which is, it's really interesting to sit down, and so he's taken a sort of a lecture and cut it up into little sound bites, and he played them over onto audio cassettes, and you sit and you listen to these cassettes, and you have to change cassettes constantly to get some sort of coherence, which of course you don't get because you don't know what order the cassettes are in. But it becomes sort of it becomes a very strange experience to deal with this. The old media materiality of the cassette really put to an extreme, where you only have these few seconds on one piece. And also the wall that we've been all discussing a lot by Ingrid Bjørnseth, which I think is a very funny piece, not because of the color, but because of the wallpaper that you put on the walls in the context of the art gallery,
Yeah.
where especially if you know anyone who's been working with producing exhibitions, the clean, very sleek wall is how, or especially one who's been producing exhibitions in this house, the clean, sleek wall is the perfect art wall, which has become a very it's become the wall that everybody wants in their home as well. Whereas this wallpaper that she's put up, that's sort of the remnant of the 90s interior decoration that everyone wants to get rid of today and tries to find the best way to cover it up. And so to put that in the institution of the Kunsthall is, I think, quite funny. Yeah.
Well, and also in relation to the title, Do Walls Blush,
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
something really funny about that being like the awkward wall that doesn't fit into the rest and feels a little bit embarrassed and timid about it.
I don't know.
I feel like this is the moment where we should have one of these very awkward pauses so that someone will really ask a question. Because or else we will just keep on talking and it feels disgenerous that we are not, that no one has asked anything, that we've been talking so much and haven't let you ask anything just yet. So let's try.
That is now working. A microphone if you want to ask a question. We're also live streaming, so it's great to talk into the microphone.
If nobody has a question, can I go back to something that's really annoying, but I'm going to push on a little bit?
I have something I want to go back to
Yeah.
too. Wait a second.
You mentioned a sort of rethinking of masculinity as a theme in the exhibition, and I think that's super interesting, and it's absolutely there. But it's really funny because our class is like all women and like 4 guys. So I'm curious what you thought about the feminine presence, or something in between, or I don't know.
You're asking me?
Anybody.
Or so anybody?
It's an open question.
Yeah. No, since I said that, I could answer perhaps that. I'm not saying that it is a theme in the whole exhibition. I was saying that it was a theme in those, in the works that I mentioned. And I mean, you can always, being someone who researches gender, bodies, sexualities, there's always gender everywhere. There could be. But I thought in those projects it was somehow visible. And I also thought that in Mari Nordal's soft objects, which resonated with the kind of tendency that you would have in certain types of feminist works. Doesn't have to be it, but it's sort of underlining the bodily incompleteness, fragmented character, and also the fact that they're looking at themselves, presenting themselves in front of a mirror, does make it, does resonate a lot with questions of narcissism, being looked at, or performing one's identity, recognizing oneself as you are mirrored by society, and you are mirrored as an incomplete. Renegotiate that kind of thing, which is very much present, has been very much present in feminist theory and amongst feminist working. And I think I wouldn't go through the whole thing and say that it's all about gender or sexuality. And I think that's what's interesting about it, because this is this kind of type of research that I have been doing over time, is that 15 years ago, those kinds of questions were a lot about performativity. They were asked in photography as a medium, or in very textual types of works, whereas now they seem to be present themselves in much more material ways in cloth and in ceramics and in blobs and in those kinds of much closer to affect, much closer to the body, and this, in a different way than they used to do. And the question of masculinity has become much stronger. So it's perhaps more explicitly present here than in some exhibitions before, but I think it's very difficult to say that kind of thing because all kind of master exhibitions are different, and it also depends on who's in school at that time. So it's not something that takes the pulse on the whole.
I think though
scene.
that also maybe if we draw this away from like a gendered, like a kind of binary, then maybe especially Marie's piece is, because for me it was never about femininity, even though it's pink, even though it's like glittery and has that like zazazu to it, but it was more about this idea of maybe performing your gender, and that can be something that, like those objects to me don't scream woman, you know, made fragmented in the mirror. It just screams to a body, like a bodily shape that could be, that is just bodily, that isn't necessarily gendered and has an expression and has a way of performing itself, which is on its own conditions. And I mean, as somebody who like watches a lot of, you know, RuPaul's Drag Race, for example, it has this quality of discussing what, for example, what like blob realness might be, you know, of like expressing yourself in what you want to and pushing people out of the way and having this like a kind of a variety show. And in that sense, the space that those blobs are occupying, which is funny also to be, I mean, the conversation around this is funny, and those objects are funny because they're blobs and they're like clad in pink glitter, and here we are dissecting them with Foucault, you know, but there's like, I mean, more of an open space maybe. So maybe more, the way I see it, more than being a renegotiation of masculinity, it's more of a renegotiation of the body and how it expresses itself and how that performance can happen. And it's not necessarily narcissistic, but it can just be...
I'm not saying that it is narcissistic, it's staging
right.
narcissism.
Is it though?
In a sense.
Could it just be staging, like, you know, like the fabulousness of Blob?
Well, I think it's
Well, you got
the
mirror.
fabulousness of Blob comes from the fact that it is a blob.
Or it can
That
be a
is seen-
practice, or a space of
yeah.
rehearsal, or a space of, like, if gender is performed, are those things rehearsing their gender's performance? Because they're in front of a mirror, like in a dance studio, or rehearsing a choreography that's spontaneous and, you know, goes along this one motor, which is, if we're going to get, like, really metaphorical about it, could be, like, one normative thing that pushes and bumps other, you know, rhythms into these objects.
I just wanted to comment on that on a very formal note, that obviously there is a nice little relation to one of the pieces we haven't talked about, the Andreas Dyrdahl piece on the other side of which is one of the male artists' pieces, but which is basically this piece of molten that sort of alludes to being a stage curtain. And that you have like the front and the back of that, and you, in a way, walking around that could be entering the stage and exiting. So there's a little bit of staging around this.
Is it the curtain?
Yeah.
The curtain,
It's the curtain,
but
okay.
it's a photographic print of a molten. So it's cheating you in terms of materials. But yeah, super interesting question, and obviously interesting with this.
But we haven't mentioned the piece that deals most directly with
No, I was
femininity.
just about to go there.
Well,
the Camilla
Camilla
Langeland piece.
Langland's Oh,
in
Sweet
the-
Liberty, I ate that all.
Yeah.
And
Which is the triptych you see right when you enter the space,
Yeah.
where you have a photographing print that looks like the L'origine du monde in the center, which basically makes you look into a female crotch.
yeah, I don't know what to say about it. To be frank, I have problems reading it. I think maybe I get too focused on the title, and go into thinking about "Oh sweet liberty, I ate thou all," and go into thinking about cultural radicalism and sort of the trajectory of cultural radicalism. But I'm not sure if that's reading it right. So I'm very interested in hearing what you think.
I mean, is there a relationship between the fact that there's cultural references to a very like conservative art history with the triptych and, I mean, Courbet was like, you know, the bad boy painter of his time. Like he was really a radical, but at the same time, this falls into a certain type of discourse of painting.
And just to say that Courbet is the painter who painted originally this painting I was talking about before, called L'Origine du Monde, which shows the same motive, a female crutch, that Camilla is showing here in the photography.
Anyway, so just to like kind of set a precedence to this, is there a relationship maybe between a conservative aesthetic of painting and the radicalism implied in a crotch shot?
Maybe. And who you were saying, I think, Espen, talking a little bit about the references to this, other references of this piece being Hieronymus Bosch and his one of his triptychs that shows the kind of the making of the world and the end of it in one. So yeah, definitely sort of powering with sort of massive cornerstones of art history here, and those being,
But I think
quote unquote, made by
that's
male.
kind of difficult to read from the piece, that it is that I might have missed something. But
I knew it because of the
it looks like a sort of a triptych altar thing, but to me it reads like a reflection on the materiality of photography and the traditions of photography in the 19th century, both L'Origine du Monde, which is a painting, but it's also a painting that is related to photography, was used for contemporary pornography, very useful at the time when it came. Exactly those kinds of shots, not showing the face, just simply showing this part of the body, which is the interesting part if you're doing pornography. And also the exact imprints of plants that you see on one side, which is the first kind of proto-photography. And also photography as used for photographing, for example, the pyramids are on the other side of. So you have the sort of photography as a way of exploring the world, exploring sexuality, using it as a way of exploring sexuality and as a means of getting access to that in a new way that you couldn't before, and also the materiality of the imprint of photography, and written in a sort of religious framing. I'm not quite sure what it says about, if we're going to talk about gender, it's critical in a sense about gender, but it's very much 19th. I think it feels very 19th century.
I think it says
which is interesting in itself, but that doesn't make it.
Sure.
So the gender criticism of it is not the most.
Maybe that's not the point. I mean,
No.
it says something that the one shot of a woman is the one thing that everybody, first of all, navigates toward. Like, this is the obvious comment on femininity, blah, blah, blah. But it's also the only one that we can't discuss because being woman doesn't imply a discussion on gender necessarily, or doesn't imply a discussion on. And I mean, in this case, referencing Courbet's L'Origine du Monde is like a pretty direct reference to talking about some sort of sexuality, but maybe it does have to do more about this like reproduction of photography or the introduction of a certain type of images that are available to us, or maybe even by extension the way we look at art these days, which is through photography, online or whatever, prevalently.
Yeah, it is found photography. Am I right to say that? Yeah. So it has that quality of reshuffling material you find somewhere. So I think we should take another question. Yeah.
You talked a lot about it, but I still feel like we can get slightly deeper into this, and that was the part about the democraticness of the group show. And I would like to just point into this from the red bench, just emphasizing the fact that it's a bench, not a chair. It is inviting you to share the experience with someone and maybe talking about this democratic exhibition from that perspective as well.
Yeah, and there's also an important point that it's the staff at the Kunsthal who place the bench. It's not a curatorial decision or an artistic decision. Of course, it's their decision to have the staff move it around, but the placement itself is decided by the staff. I think. Well, the common experiencing something together is sort of is a very important starting point for dealing with the democratic potential of art in itself. But of course, there's only room for two, so it has its limits, and also and trying to reach some sort of common understanding. You never, even if when you sit next to each other, you always have a slightly different view, and trying to discuss what it is we're seeing. We have to go through language, which is difficult. So, in that sense, it's always a negotiation, but it's. I think the show makes a forceful, or tries to make a forceful statement about the maybe not the need for it, but that the possibility of it. Yeah.
Well, the chair in particular, because I mean, in some sense, if loosely, if democracy and exhibition spaces can be somewhat of a burden to organize, then reshuffling that and having somebody within the space labor to make togetherness happen by placing a bench in front of things that you're forced to look at is then a way of redirecting attention and making these things, like forcing communication in some way in what, let's face it, is a very alienated and alienating art world.
Yeah.
Maybe there is a similar kind of public or co-viewing situation in the backspace when you enter and go left, which would be the very other end, which is the piece by Aski Dahl, where you have this kind of alluded to shadow play going on. It is called a drawing, but obviously it has very sort of theatrical qualities, which again plays on a different kind of audience configuration than a sort of typical solemn individual viewer in the art world, but in a way would presume that you would be more people if it is actually or indeed an act or a performance going on. So maybe there is another place there where not only the exhibition plays on a democratic principle as a principle of organization, but it also is trying to establish a democratic spectatorship.
Really? Because I was really under the impression when I saw it that you have this object that you can't quite see, and maybe it does form a drawing, but it's also very voyeuristic, because it's like looking at something through that where you're not supposed to gain access to it fully, or you're like peering at somebody through a shower curtain that's like steamed up or something, or it's the striptease of a drawing, or but I think you could almost talk about that as kind of queering the sort of fourth wall of the classical theatrical space, and sort of making it difficult to access and making it in need of you to move around it, and because you are, I think, right that you're in a way voyeuristically getting up close in different
ends of the piece to sort of see if you actually maybe could understand what's behind. But yeah.
Yeah.
But maybe in that sense it does sort of come back to a different kind of individual movement.
Yeah, well, I feel like it's pretty, well, even if you move around a little bit, there's only so much space in that room that you have to move around. There's an object behind you that you're wary of that on the wall, which is there. It's a presence. You know, you're not alone in the space, but you also know you can't access behind it. So you're left confronted with this thing that you kind of need space away from to see as a drawing, yet you're too close to see what the object is, and there's a very odd relationship that forms with it, which somehow, yeah.
But I did think about that. I mean, we potentially disagree on the audience function here, but I did think about that as very coming back to these kind of sort of feminist maybe strategies that had to me a very sort of maybe not feminist but very sort of obvious sort of play on a kind of sensual and sort of gender biased role that you would always be prone to have as an audience member. So in a way it would sort of play out my voyeurism and sort of test it to a particular degree. Okay, I think we should slowly wrap up. It's we've been going on for I think 1.5 hours, and that seems like a lot of words. But I do think it would be nice if there's one more question as a kind of last.
No one's angry at us, at least.
I think that is.
Yeah, just wait till we get into the alley.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment or both. I'm just a bit curious about the dynamic of the entire talk or discussion, because even though you said that you weren't going to go through the 26 different works on artists, it became to me like small reviews on like everyone's work. But then you didn't manage to go through all of them, so of course that's I don't think that's specifically a problem. But I'm curious about if it was difficult to find a thread or something that would cover the exhibition more as a group exhibition instead of like small bits of different themes or topics, because then to me that fragmentates the entire show, and then I got just a bit confused, and then I'm just curious, how do you
Maybe I should say a little bit about that, because in a way that is so I think that part of the strategy of looking a little bit more at individual works was to say that, and in a way to honor the fact that when a group of MA students is put into this show, it's always somewhat arbitrary, and to try and make a beautiful curatorial or exhibition kind of arch over that is difficult and maybe impossible. And if we would sit and criticize that for a long time, that would be, I think, actually the easiest way to talk about a show like this, because it's often the kind of escape route from talking about these many different positions. Having said that, I think you're obviously completely right. It is difficult and ungenerous that we cannot cover everything. We actually spoke a little bit about this beforehand. We spoke about this word triage as a kind of structuring system in which you decide what is more urgent and less urgent, and that in that sense we become part of deciding what is more urgent and what is less urgent. And in a funny way, actually, triage then almost be a little bit being a title that shows to all of these priorities made in a show that actually tries to be very democratic in its distribution and rhythm and pace. So it's very, in that sense, it feels very, rhythmic, sort of same scale, it functions. There's a kind of an aesthetic. There's not that many collisions in the exhibition, and. So of course there's a kind of double. It's kind of double this, and my answer is that yes, we will not cover everything, and yes, it's not great, but we will be in the bar after this, and we're happy to talk about all of the other shows, all the other works in the exhibition, in the show, that we didn't cover. But I also think that is why it would be super to have feedback, questions, because I think a lot of the elements we have covered or talked about, maybe, or strategies we've talked about, maybe does kind of pull us into one route, but I would love for us to be bounced into another if there is a.
Yeah, of course, and my point wasn't that you didn't cover like 1, 2, 3, or 4 works. Like, I think that's not super relevant now that the conversation is finished, but it's just to create certain awareness on, or like, how can we find like different strategies to cover a whole, like, without getting loose into specifics, because I feel that makes things a little bit unbalanced. And that was my impression. Not saying like it's not generous to talk about everybody, but then if one is not to talk about every specific work, then how can we make it a bit more effective in terms of covering an entire theme or an entire strategy, or like the use of the space, or all these things that you mentioned at last. Like I'm like there. That what I would like to. I would have liked to hear more.
Yeah, no, I think it was a little bit of a deliberate choice, but I will completely put that on my cape. Yeah.
Maybe I can just add to this that, I mean, and this is maybe where the knives come out, but on one hand, when you're working professionally, and especially as a critic or as a writer, and you're confronted with these different methods of writing or different exhibition strategies, for example, the MFA is probably the hardest thing, as you were saying, to write about or to discuss, because it isn't as simple as a curator has created a show and there's a theme, so you can talk about everything through that lens in some way, or that there's a solo show of an artist who you can engage with singularly. But here's a bunch of budding professionals who are each working in their own idiosyncratic ways, and there is this togetherness maybe, but there's also the inevitable fact of splintering, and the inevitable fact then also is, like, when you enter into the professional life, is that, like, there will be cherry picking from that group, and there will be a certain type of cherry picking from any kind of group that you have. So even if you're writing about, I mean, my example earlier was something like the Venice Biennial, where you go and you're looking at the Arsenale and you have all of the pavilions in the Giardini, and you're given this task to review it in 1,000 words. You're going to pick out a certain amount of things. And this isn't a numbers question, but you also have to isolate certain themes that feel, like we were saying, urgent, or that feel relevant. And it is going to exclude a lot of people, and it is going to exclude a lot of ideas that are also interesting. But for the sake of maybe concision or lifting up things that feel relevant to a social circumstance or a political circumstance or whatever. That being said, in this context, I mean, I think maybe a part of these questions that come up in most contexts of maybe like a political activism or ecology or feminism or materialisms, the MFA structure itself, and this is kind of why I was trying to push this, is what becomes interesting and what becomes the common framework. And it really is the only thing that is like the umbrella. Like, that's the only thing that you can definitely say about everybody that you have in common, you know? And so, I mean, just to like get back to this discussion, yeah, it is important to consider the school as a Norwegian thing, but it is also a global question of like how to approach the MFA and how to approach whether this is a financial question or a political one. And I think that there's certain problems involved with that kind of localistic thinking of, you know, like the academy in Bergen only of this kind of thing, but, you know, and maybe this is something to hand over to the students themselves, of how they perceive themselves in a Norwegian academy doing a show like this in the face of a career in what could presumably be a contemporary or globalized art world, and what you want from that.
which
Okay.
might be a very good place to end.
At the bar.
Yeah.
And then and then I think, yeah, it would be very nice to
Discuss.
continue informally. Yeah, after having had the more formal part done. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for the questions, and thanks, first of all, obviously, for the enormous work doing a show that is great. And I think we should actually applaud that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the panelists and Rhea, moderator. I will just inform you that if you want to re-experience this experience, this is out on YouTube, so you can do that. Okay, thank you.